Well, welcome. Welcome. I'm Greg Lucas, the state librarian, and it's a pleasure having you here, and I hope you're enjoying what's for sure the third coolest conference room in the state of California. And I'll tell you why I say that. If you've been to a Silomar on the Monterey coast, and if you're at a Silomar, you look out the window and you see the Pacific Ocean crashing on the beach there. That's for sure the coolest conference room that the state of California has. And there's a famous interview with Neil Young where somebody says, "Hey, aren't you and your band Crazy Horse the greatest garage band ever?" And he says, "No, the Rolling Stones are the greatest garage band ever. And I'll bet you somewhere, maybe, there's another group that's better than us, but for sure, we're number 3. This is also the only place you'll ever see a seal of the great state of California in which the bear is eating the grapes. And it looks to me that the grapes must be fermented because the bear's got a big smile on his face. So enough about me. I'm going to introduce now the Chief of Staff to California's first partner, Jennifer Siebel Newsom, Becky Beelan McNaught, who's going to introduce our 2 authors.
Embarrassed to say it was my first time in this building, even though I'm a Sacramento native. It is wonderful to be with you all here tonight. As Greg said, I'm Jennifer Siebel Newsom's Chief of Staff. Gender equity has been at the root of Jennifer's work throughout her career. Most recently as a documentary filmmaker, exploring the ways in which our society's limiting gender stereotypes harm women and men. Jennifer wrote and directed 3 films, and the common thread is the need to put women at the center of the story, to recognize that our perspectives, experiences, and ideas must be listened to and prioritized. The Office of the First Partner is dedicated to continuing this narrative by championing efforts that acknowledge the central role of women in our families, our communities, and our economy. We're excited to elevate women, give voice to the unique challenges they face at home and at work, and celebrate their history and contributions across society. Paving the Way is the perfect roadmap for how to do just that. The extraordinary women profiled embody grit, determination, and gumption by refusing to back down no matter the cost. The authors do an incredible job weaving the history of women's struggle for representation from the suffrage movement through current day political protests, with the stories of remarkable women who for so long have been written out of the narrative. Women like Naomi Anderson, who organized African American suffrage clubs. Anna Saylor, the first women to serve in a governor's cabinet. And Felicitas Mendez, a Mexican immigrant who launched a legal fight that helped bring down California's decades-old school segregation laws. This is just a tiny example of the incredible women featured in this book. These are stories more of us should know about because they give us the true context for understanding our California history and how we came to be the most inclusive, diverse, and forward-thinking state in the nation. As we celebrate Women's History Month, I hope we all take a moment to recognize the achievements of the women whose shoulders we stand on, celebrate their courage, and plot how to tackle the obstacles ahead, because there is still so much work to do together. So with that, I have the privilege of introducing Steve Swatt and Susie Swatt, co-authors of Paving the Way, Women's Struggle for Political Equality in California. Steve is a veteran political analyst and public affairs executive. He's a former award-winning political reporter with 25 years of journalism experience with the San Francisco Examiner, United Press International in Los Angeles, and KCRA in Sacramento. Susie is a member of the National Advisory Council of the Institute of Governmental Studies at UC Berkeley. She spent nearly 40 years as a key staff member in the California Legislature. And the Swats are also co-authors of Game Changers, 12 elections that transformed California. So, Susie and Steve, thank you. Well,
Thank you very much, Becky, and here's Susie. I'm going to start off, but I want you all, wait a minute, you can stay here for a minute. I want you to meet Susie, all right. Now you can go. A few years ago, Susie and I and two other friends who were both former journalists decided it might be kind of fun in semi-retirement to write a book about California history, since if you add up all four of our careers, we probably spent 150 years either covering at the state capitol or working inside the capitol. And we wrote that book. It was called Game Changers, 12 Elections That Transformed California. And after we finished it, we realized that that book was about men, almost exclusively. Men were writing the history, right? From Leland Stanford to Earl Warren to Howard Jarvis and Pat Brown and William Mulholland, the Water King in Los Angeles. And so we decided, we know women made a tremendous contribution. Let's try to find out what those contributions were, and maybe we can write a book about them. So we started doing research, and this was the first place we started, here at the State Library, and we found some amazing stories. And so that became Paving the Way. And Paving the Way really is about storytelling. And so many of those stories, as I mentioned, are right here at the State Library. Whether it is scholarly books, collections that have been donated, or the newspaper archives. I spent so much time here, I used to joke that maybe we should get a cot and just move me into the California History Room, and I'll just spend a few nights here going through all this, the wonderful stuff they have here. So I really want to thank Greg and his predecessors going back to 1850 for doing such a great job with the State Library. Now, we tend to think of public policy makers as those who are closest to the levers of power, such as elected officials. But California history is replete with so many examples of women who were really barred from participating in the political process in many cases, and yet achieved so many great accomplishments, and especially during the first 60 years of statehood before they even had the vote. So tonight, we decided just to touch on a few stories and few instances that we relay in the book. They're stories that are critical to the story of women's future political development. And one of them is the fight for suffrage, which I'm going to talk about. And then Susie will come up and talk about the fight for conservation and environmentalism. And again, these are stories, especially the environmentalism part that Susie will talk about, that you just will not find them in history books. I mean, they're just not there. And that's what was so exciting to us, to find stories that we couldn't find elsewhere and then talk about them. So I'm going to start off talking about the suffrage. The arduous fight for women's suffrage was a four-decade epic, really. Women knew that they would never be equal to men until they were allowed to vote, but men were, of course, territorial, and they didn't want to give up that vote. Every time a bill was introduced in the legislature, the men would shoot it down. Women were not smart enough to vote, some of the men said. Others said women were too pure and wholesome to be sullied by the dark arts of politics. In 1893, a measure did pass the legislature, but Governor Henry Markham decided to veto it. And that was kind of interesting because he vetoed it because he thought it was unconstitutional. He didn't let the courts decide that, he just decided it unilaterally. In 1896, the legislature put a suffrage measure on the statewide ballot. And women scrambled to organize and to raise funds for a statewide campaign in which only men could vote, of course. National suffrage leaders like Susan B. Anthony came into California to lend a hand for the campaign. Anthony by then was in her 70s, and yet she would go around Northern California, that was her territory, and give up to 3 speeches a day. The San Francisco Chronicle had called her a female agitator. Primarily, the campaign was run by and for the elite, upper middle class, upper class women. In other words, minorities and working women generally were not invited to participate, and that turned out to be a problem. 250 newspapers endorsed suffrage in that 1896 election. 27 did not. One of those against was the crusty, and there he is, the crusty publisher of the Los Angeles Times, Harrison Gray Otis. He was extremely conservative and anti-union, and he controlled, obviously, the LA Times, and he accused women of being mercenaries who would sell their vote to the highest bidder. Ultimately, the measure lost by 26,000 votes. The scales were tipped by a last-minute barrage of publicity by the liquor industry. It was afraid that if women had the vote, they would vote for temperance, prohibition. And so they had flyers and outreach in every tavern and every bar in California, especially in San Francisco, which was the largest city in California. There seemed to be a tavern on every street corner. And the message was, if you vote for women's suffrage, you'll never see a beer again. So the final vote was 26,000 against, the margin was 26,000, as I mentioned, and San Francisco voted 3-1 against suffrage. During the next 14 years, a handful of women did their best to keep the movement going, but the suffrage movement was really flagging at the time. And they still refused to give up. One attempt after another was shut down by the legislature. Political parties would endorse suffrage and then renege on their pledge. In 1906, at her own expense, a woman named Katherine Ballantine started the first suffrage newspaper on the Pacific Coast. It was called the Yellow Ribbon. It even scored an interview with President Teddy Roosevelt, who said, quote, public sentiment was not yet strong enough for him to endorse suffrage. Rare editions of the Yellow Ribbon are here at the State Library and are available for researchers. I thought I'd pass that on. Greg would want me to do that. That same year, 1906, Governor James Gillette became a silent hero for the suffragists, or so they thought. At the Republican State Convention in Santa Cruz, Gillette walked out of the convention tent to a bunch of women standing on the beach. And these were suffragists, and they were there to try to put pressure on the Republican convention to endorse suffrage. And so he walks up to them, and walks up to one woman by the name of Lillian Coffin and says, I know who you are. You're a leader in the suffrage movement. And she says, yes, I am. And he says, well, I want you to know that I am running for the Republican nomination for governor here at this convention. And if I get that nomination, and if I win the election, you will have a friend in the governor's office. Whoa, that was a big deal, right? A couple years later, when there was a bill languishing in the legislature, Lillian Coffin goes to the governor and has a face-to-face meeting with him and says, basically, I'm here to call in the chit. And we think that if you can endorse suffrage right now, it would go a long way into dislodging this bill in the legislature. And he said, why would I do that? And she said, because you promised. And he said, no, I didn't promise that. And then she said, well, you did talk about that. Yes, you did. And he said, well, I was just joking. And then he said, really, the way I believe is I think all women should be at home with the kids. And so that's why I say that the long, epic battle of suffrage is littered with betrayal and promises made and promises unkept. In 1910, the progressives, led by Hiram Johnson, were swept into office. And although Johnson personally did not favor suffrage for women, he didn't stand in the way of progressives who put a measure on the 1911's special election ballot in October. It was another uphill battle, though, and once again, the LA Times led the opposition with another ridiculous argument. It said it did not believe in the justice or the expediency, quote, of burdening the women of California with the duty of voting. But other newspapers, including the influential San Francisco Call and the Sacramento Bee and others, pushed for the vote. In this Sacramento Bee editorial cartoon, a man is saying, why shouldn't my mother vote? The campaign used innovative techniques to secure votes, to attract male voters, and this is one of my favorite stories, to attract male voters who wouldn't bother to go to a suffrage speech. They brought in a 1910 Packard touring car. It's called a Blue Liner. And what they would do is they would take this car, they would drive it into the city, they'd park it at a street corner, and then just leave it there. And they would wait for all the men to arrive and to start looking at the upholstery and lifting up the hood and checking out the woodwork and this, that, and the other. And then when there were enough men had shown up, women would pop up and give them a speech. And so that's how they tried to get to the women. On posters and flyers, the campaign repeated the slogan, "Give your girl an equal chance with your boy." And this time the movement sought working class women and minorities to help out. And they also went to rural areas that were disregarded during the 1896 campaign. Now, suffragist Selina Sullivan wrote the only detailed first-person account of the campaign. She came from a wealthy family from San Francisco, a Sephardic Jewish family that traced its roots back to Spain in the 1400s and in Britain during the 1500s. Her great-grandfather participated in George Washington's inaugural in 1787, and her father came to California during the gold rush and was a founder of one of the largest, if not the largest, temple in San Francisco, Temple Emmanuel. And her brother and sister, they were famous, pretty famous too. So she came from a prominent, wealthy family, but she connected with the working class and with working women, and understood that one of the failures of the 1896 campaign was white elitism that kept secretaries and shop girls and clerks and women working in the canneries, for example, out of the official suffrage effort. She brought them in, and then those women became articulate advocates for the suffrage cause. In her book, Sullivan talks about the utter despair on election night, when the vote count showed the suffrage measure losing, and losing pretty badly that night, especially in vote-rich San Francisco. She got so upset with watching the election returns that she left and started walking by herself along Market Street. And as she did that, she was taunted by young men who would say, "You're never going to get the vote. You're never going to get the vote." And she would walk on. Another time she heard two men behind her saying, "These women, these uppity women, all they want to do is destroy homes." And that was enough for her. She wheeled around and said, "We do not want to destroy homes. We just want to be on an equal footing with the men, and we need this vote." So the end of the vote, by the end of Tuesday night, election night, the suffrage was well behind. 2 days later, however, votes started trickling in from the miners and the farmers in the rural areas and from Southern California. And by the end of the day, Thursday, after that Tuesday election, suffrage had won. Barely, by 3,500 votes, but they barely won. And you know what put them over the top? Los Angeles, home of the LA Times, right? The suffrage leaders had learned from their mistakes in 1896, and whereas 36 counties had voted against suffrage that year, only 8 said no in 1911. By about, as I mentioned, 3,500 votes, California then became the 6th and largest state to give women the vote. In San Francisco, still heavily influenced by liquor interests, suffrage still lost, but by a smaller margin than in 1896. And the California vote then, as quite often now, was a trendsetter. In the ensuing 7 years, 9 other states, including Michigan and New York, followed California's lead and adopted many of its strategies to give women the vote. And of course, in 1920, there was the national suffrage for women. And that was, again, 9 years after California. One of the ongoing arguments against giving women the vote was that they didn't really want it. And that argument prevailed for many years. And there were some women who argued against suffrage, that we don't need to do this. Well, 2 months later in Los Angeles, that city held municipal elections. And 70,000 women stood in long lines to register to vote. And 65,000 of them voted. So much for that argument that women didn't want the vote. So I've touched on just a few women pioneers and activists who took personal and political risks and succeeded, but it wasn't easy. It was a constant struggle. They fought the system and the entrenched political, social, and cultural barriers to make California a better place. Even after the California women were given the vote, it wasn't until 1918 that 4 women broke barriers and became the first women elected to the state legislature. They were elected to the assembly. All of them had deep ties to their communities. All of them crushed male adversaries, including one who argued, and this was his major argument during the campaign, that women were too weak to serve in the legislature. They transitioned from novelties to lawmakers, and they left lasting imprints on significant public policy issues. They sponsored legislation to improve the lives of women and children and the less fortunate, issues that had largely been ignored previously. And one other sidelight I know Greg wants to hear, the best research that I found on these women are not in history books. I couldn't find anything on them. But there is an unfinished manuscript here at the State Library, and all of this woman's research that she did before she passed away. And there are boxes of it, and it's just fascinating to read. So again, thanks to Greg and your predecessors. At the outset, I mentioned that we were going to talk about a couple of things. One was suffrage, but the other one, maybe I didn't even mention it, but the other one is women's involvement in conservation and in environmentalism, and Susie's going to talk about that.
So we're now in the 20th century, and for a number of years, before women could even vote, they formed clubs and turned to civic participation to improve their communities and build the public trust. For example, women led the fight against a rat infestation in San Francisco after the 1906 earthquake. In Los Angeles, Katherine led an investigation of tainted milk that had caused the death of several children and infants. She traced the bad milk to a dairy cow with tuberculosis, to several dairy cows with tuberculosis, and the women forced government to improve oversight of the dairies. And women were instrumental in California's conservation and environmental movements. More than 100 years ago, even before women were allowed to vote, women convinced presidents, governors, and lawmakers to save ancient 2,000-year-old redwoods along the North Coast, in the Sierra foothills, and in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And women also reshaped the fashion industry with a campaign to save millions of birds from being slaughtered and then stuffed, only to adorn women's hats. And we have a picture of that over there. Let's go forward to 1943 in Los Angeles. We're in the middle of World War II. The year before, in 1942, the Japanese had attacked an oil field off the coast of Santa Barbara. On July 26, 1943, the sky was thick, brown, and smoky. Eyes stung. Noses ran. Visibility was near zero. Many people thought it was a Japanese attack, a gas attack from the Japanese. Instead, this was the first major smog attack in Los Angeles. During the 50s and 60s, people in Los Angeles breathed some of the dirtiest air in the entire world. Crackpots, of course, came out of the woodwork to offer solutions. One suggested using a cannon to blow a hole in the inversion layer so the smog could escape. Another wanted to use giant fans to blow the smog away. But one scientist said it would take 4 years of output from Hoover Dam to generate enough electricity to power those fans for just 1 day. By the late 1950s, smog alerts were routine, and the problem was not improving. That's when a small group of Beverly Hills socialites, smog fighters in high heels, if you will, decided to fight back. They were the wives of actors, producers, and others associated with Hollywood, whose children were having respiratory problems because of the polluted air. They formed a group called Stamp Out Smog, SOS. Margaret Levy was its first president, and she ran the organization out of the living room from her home. SOS had two goals: galvanize public opinion and advocate for environmental change. Using their Hollywood connections, they started with colorful protests designed to attract media attention, and they got it. They also had their children in marches wearing gas masks. They rented a room at the famed Ambassador Hotel to celebrate a big birthday or a big anniversary. That was the 21st anniversary of LA's first smog attack. But these women did more than just generate publicity. They became experts on unleaded gasoline, catalytic converters, and other smog abatement technology. They testified at local, regional, and state hearings. They even had the ear of Governor Pat Brown. All the while, they grew Stamp Out Smog from 9 original founders to an organization with more than 400 groups as coalition partners and a combined membership in the tens of thousands. And we know that SOS and its female leaders were having an impact. When a bill was introduced to require exhaust control devices on all new cars, SOS activated phone trees and letters to boost turnout at a Capitol hearing. And they paid for newspaper ads urging readers to send letters to Governor Brown and to legislators. The bill passed, becoming the California Motor Vehicle Control Act. It was the nation's first ever statewide air pollution control law. It created a new board to set standards for the devices. The board included scientists, public health officers, academics, motor vehicle experts, and Margaret Levy of Stamp Out Smog. One newspaper editorialized, and I quote, that Stamp Out Smog probably concentrates the most potent female determination ever directed towards achievement of a common goal in the long history of our Golden State. When I worked in the legislature all those many years ago, my boss had authored a couple of landmark measures to reduce smog. One was the creation of the South Coast Air Quality Management District in Southern California. And there was also a mandate for gas stations to install vapor recovery devices at the pumps. I can tell you firsthand, those women and other citizen lobbyists helped us generate support and push the bills through the legislature. Veteran environmental lobbyist John White said the women created a sense that public well-being was at risk. LA County's chief air pollution officer, Louis Fuller, put it this way: SOS is more potent than any women's organization I've ever heard of anywhere. These SOS women are afraid of no one. One other story. Sabrina Schiller joined Stamp Out Smog in her mid-20s. She was a former Playboy bunny and actress, and she agonized over her husband's daily commute, being stuck in traffic and breathing in the bad air. In 1971, she organized Share a Ride Day. And for one day, LA commuters would carpool and take buses to work. Buses were arranged to drive workers from the suburbs to downtown. Paramount Studios filmed free public service announcements with Lucille Ball and the cast of The Brady Bunch. Radio reporters were placed on the buses to record the event live. And guess what? A total of 6 people showed up. At one stop, no one was there at all. It was a complete fiasco. But from the wreckage of Sabrina Schiller's ride-sharing experiment came the growing recognition that carpooling can help with air pollution and highway congestion. At a PTA meeting back in the early 1960s, then SOS President Afton Slade gave a presentation, and one woman got up and asked her, "Sure, air pollution is bad, but what can a bunch of women do about it?" Well, one LA supervisor credited the women's support for helping to enact more than 150 rules governing pollution. Whether it's preventing the massacre of millions of birds, or saving majestic redwoods from the sawmill, or pressuring government and the people to do more in the fight against smog, women, many of them lost to history, have been in the forefront of making California a better place to live. We'll gladly take any questions, just not on this topic, but any topic in terms of women in California history.
Come on.
Oh, there you go. Thanks, Alex. Yes, he'll come to you.
So I just wanted to ask about the book. So we were actually looking online, and it seems like it's very hard to find. How can we find it to read it?
Well, first of all, it's on Amazon, and you should
There's
be able
only
to.
2 copies left on Amazon.
Well, I guess it's doing well, and it's also overpriced, and so it just so happens. And thank you for that question. We have books right here that we are discounting by 33%.
Thanks, Greg.
I can throw out a few more stories if you want. Yes.
I just wondered a little bit more about your process of putting the book together and how long it took you.
It was about 2.5 years, and it was interesting. The research was great because these were women that we had not heard of. Now, certainly the book, it goes up to, current day. So, there's Dianne Feinstein and Barbara Boxer, the Year of the Woman, 1992, when California became the first state to have 2 U.S. senators serve simultaneously, and a lot of stuff in between. But especially the old stuff, and even Stamp Out Smog in the 50s and 60s. We just researched, and you read and you pick up one nugget here and there, and then you try to find some more expansive information on them. And at times it was difficult because, again, California history books don't have much about these women at all.
I just want to add, we have offices in our home next to one another. And I'm going to have them tell you the story, but one day I found out about this one woman named Clara Foltz. And I screamed at Steve. I said, "Oh my God, you're not going to believe what I found." Because it was so interesting to find these stories. And we did a lot of this also by reading a lot of different newspapers. A lot here at the library, old newspapers that, thank goodness that they're still here. Why don't you tell them the story
And those
of
old
Clara Foltz?
newspapers, of course, are fun to read. From those old reporters. I'm going to tell you the Clara Foltz story since Susie mentioned it. Anybody ever hear of Clara Foltz? Oh, a few.
Good.
Okay, so then that's more than most of the audiences. So bear with us. But Clara Foltz grew up in the Midwest, and at the age of 15, she eloped with a Union soldier during the Civil War. And they started a family right away. They made it to San Jose. And in 1878, the husband decides, "I'm going to leave you and the family and go with my girlfriend." And so here is Clara Foltz with 5 children, aged 2 to 9, trying to figure out, how do I make ends meet and how do I feed my children? So she took in sewing, which was one of the few jobs that women could do back then. But that wasn't making a lot of money. She really wanted to be a lawyer. State law said women could not be lawyers. So she decided to do something about it. Again, this is 1878. So she writes a bill that would allow women to become lawyers. She takes it to a state senator in San Jose and says, "Will you carry this bill for me?" And he says, "Yes." He puts the bill in. She becomes a lobbyist. And as she later explained in her memoirs, she begged and pleaded for votes. She said, "I would have gotten down on my knees to get votes if that's what it would have taken." And after a while, in fits and starts, the bill actually passed. But the governor, William Irwin, hadn't indicated whether he would sign it or not. And there was a midnight deadline after the end of the legislative session for him to sign bills or veto bills. And so Clara Foltz and a bunch of other lobbyists are waiting outside the governor's office that last night, as it's getting closer to midnight, waiting for word on what's going to happen to this bill. All of a sudden, a man bursts through the governor's office from the inside and announces to everybody, "The lady lawyer bill is dead." Well, she was devastated, and she was angry. And when the guard wasn't looking, she slipped past him into the governor's anteroom and kept on going into the governor's inner office. And there was the governor, Irwin, signing bills behind a desk. There was an aide there, and the attorney general was there, and they're asking her, "Who are you? What are you doing here? How did you get in?" And she's trembling. Governor, you've got to sign this bill. It's very important." And the governor turns to an aide and says, "Well, where is that bill physically?" And the aide says, "Well, here's the veto pile. It's in the pile." He fishes it out, looks it over, reads it, looks up at her and says, "You know, this is a good bill. I'm going to sign it." And he did. And as she reports in her memoirs later, perhaps taking a little journalistic license, just after he signed it, the clock struck 12. There's more to the story. She then wants to go to the Hastings College of Law, which had just opened up. Now, back then, you did not have to go to law school to become a lawyer, and she got a job as an apprentice. But she thought a law degree and that education would help her with her clients. So she and another woman named Laura DeForce Gordon of Lodi pay their $10 tuition. They go to class. Yeah. They go to class, and like 3 days later, they are physically escorted out of the building. And it's because the school didn't allow women. So they did what all good lawyers do. They filed a lawsuit. And it went all the way up to the state Supreme Court, and they won. So here she opened up the workplace for women. She opened up education for women. She went on to become a leading suffragist. She was the first female lawyer in California, the first deputy DA in the United States. She created the concept of the parole system and the public defender. Clara Foltz, if you can read about her, good luck. And that's one of the stories that we found so interesting and fascinating, because very few people, except for a few people in this room, know who she is or who she was. Yes.
A record number of women were elected, and you have like several women running for president and all this. Is this really a major change in how things are going to be in political equality for women?
You want to take that one?
Yeah.
Well, can I start with California a little bit? Yeah. First of all, I have a poster over there. It's kind of hidden. But there have been 165 women elected to the legislature since the first ones were elected in 1918. Women in California, in the California legislature with the Assembly and the Senate, it's 30%. Okay, which is better than it has been in the past, but it hasn't broken a record. And so it's sad to see that. And we've only had 10 constitutional officers, which right now there are 3 serving at one time, which is a record. And we have the first female lieutenant governor, as a matter of fact. We're backwards in terms of our congressional delegations from what we used to have. We're not at a high mark there. So I think there's hope. I think that California was very interesting last year because it really picked up a lot of women in terms of increased, the congressional delegation increased by one. The legislative delegation increased tremendously, primarily because there were also several special elections in 2017, 2018. There were 6 specials, 5 were won by women. And women defeated, there were 6 Democratic women that defeated 6 Republican incumbents. Now, 2 of those Republican incumbents were women. But that was something that you do not see very often, is where a non-incumbent defeats an incumbent. There has to be really something going on. So there is this move, well, there was, yes. There is this movement in California, and I think it's going to be very interesting next year. And also, it's going to be fascinating because our primary is moved up. So we're going to be early March. And this will be both the statewide and the federal primary, the presidential primary. And that's one of the first times that they've been consolidated, and then go back to the June primary in a statewide election year. So this is going to be very interesting to see what happens. I think there is a feeling among women, look, you know, sometimes what happens, you do something and you do it right and you get confidence and you go, well, I can do this. When I look back, someone asked me a question once about these women who we have studied and really they've kind of become our friends because, you know, you're going into their lives, etc. I think that you have women, these were the type of women who said, nothing stands in our way. We can do it. And I think you're getting more of a feeling like that overall in California. Anybody else we can talk?
I'm curious about the box of the document, the unfinished manuscript that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And I also have a question that is about the huge shift in perception that it took for these changes you're talking about historically. And I'm curious if when you're sifting through the stories, you find that if there were men that were helpful and weren't just politicking on the beach and changing the story later, was there a quality or something was there some common theme that allowed those men to be more aware?
Well, for some of them, they had pretty strong wives. A.A. Sargent was a member of Congress in the U.S. Senate representing California back in the 1860s and 70s. And every year he would introduce a suffrage measure. And of course it would be shot down. But Ellen Sargent, his wife, was a leading suffragist and was very well connected. And so he believed it. He believed in equality. And there were others, and we talk about a few others in the book. And as a matter of fact, I think the dedication in our book is to the women who paved the way and the men who helped them get there, something like that. In terms of that other research, it was interesting. She was working on this book, and she died, so she never finished it. But there's a lot of her correspondence, for example, and it's on all four women. She wrote to classmates and teachers of some of these, some of the women were teachers, for example, before they were elected. And so she would write to some other teachers or some of her students to get some comments and things like that. And it's really interesting to read all that stuff. And then she had several rough drafts of her book that never got published.
Stephen's story. Governor Stevens.
Oh, well, Susie reminds me of the Governor Stevens story. William Stevens was a governor in the early 1920s in California, and the women's clubs, as she mentioned, were trying to save redwoods and throughout the state, and they had done a lot of work already, but there was still they were trying to create a park, a redwood park in Humboldt County, and Flora Stevens, the governor's wife, belonged to the Friday Morning Club in Los Angeles. And all the clubs together formed an organization, which California Federation of Women's Clubs. And one of their top priorities was save the redwoods. And so this piece of legislation creating the state park gets through the legislature. It's sitting on Governor Stevens' desk, and what it would do, it would appropriate funds for the state park. And he was going to veto it. And Flora basically said, don't you dare do that. And he changed his mind and signed it.
We thought presumably to keep peace in the family.
Yeah, right.
But, you think about these women who are not in elective office, who are on the outside, and what they were able to accomplish. They would not take no for answers. And that's the part that I think is so important to bring out to the people of California and to the children of California. I see from my grandchildren, there's other things incorporated in their studies that never were in my studies. Years ago, it seems like there's somebody who Steve really likes, is Biddy Mason. And it was in my granddaughter's history book, and I got the biggest kick out of it.
Anybody here, besides Greg, I know, ever heard of Biddy Mason? Oh, you have? Okay.
Good. Wow.
So that's a fascinating story that, was new to me, but our granddaughter told us a little bit about her, and I'll just tell you this story very quickly because it's fascinating, and it goes back to the fact that for the first 60 years after statehood, women couldn't vote. They had no real access to the political process, and yet they got things done. And for some, like the women's clubs, it was all about improving their communities. But for others, it was all about survival. And so Biddy Mason was a slave born in 1818, and in 1851, she walked 2,000 miles behind her master's wagon from Georgia to Southern California. And she gets here, and California was a free state. But the law was murky as to what to do with slaves who were illegal in Georgia and brought into California. We actually had a Fugitive Slave Act in California for a number of years. So she went to court, even though blacks could not testify against whites. And she won her freedom. And then she became a nurse and a midwife. And she moved to Los Angeles. And Los Angeles was like a pueblo back then. I mean, it was very small. It had, a couple thousand people in it. This in the 1850s. She saved her money, every nickel and dime, and she ended up buying a parcel of land. Well, it turns out that this parcel of land was smack dab in the middle of what later became the downtown business district of Los Angeles. And she made a potload of money. And then she traded some real estate and made some more money. She actually made $300,000, which in today's dollars is $9 million. And what did she do with this money? She didn't buy a fancy house. She helped the poor. She helped prisoners. She built the first church for blacks, African Americans in Los Angeles, and the first school for black children. Just a great story of philanthropy. One other, since we're on